Hello, this is John Quinlan, and welcome to Forward Forum. We're taping this show in late April, just a few days after a massive earthquake hit the South Asian country of Nepal. And I'm very pleased to have in studio two very special guests. We'll be discussing both the impact of the quake, but probably more importantly, the nature of Nepali culture, its people, its beautiful land. In many ways, trying to put in perspective what is certainly a snapshot in time when Nepal is facing many challenges. But it's very important at a time like this also to pay respect to the place in which these events are playing out, to think of folks as people and not as victims, and to paint the broader picture of all of this. Very pleased that we have in studio two very special guests. Joe Elder is with us, probably my most prolific guest in radio days and good friend. Joe is here in the context of having been faculty coordinator for the University of Wisconsin's College Year Nepal program. Joe, welcome.
It's nice to be here. Thanks, John.
Good to have you here. Very pleased also that Krishna Pradhan is here. Krishna wears many hats, but the one is probably most relevant to today is that he's a longtime Nepali instructor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Krishna, very pleased that you could be here today.
Thank you for having me.
So, gentlemen, I think actually we'll go right into something I was telling you about. I came across a video online. It was a video produced by a young reporter for the New York Times. And he, I believe as recently as just a month or so ago, had been on the ground in the Kathmandu Valley and had captured some beautiful images. And as we'll be discussing throughout the hour, some of the sacred shrines and the buildings and the other things have been lost in the earthquake. But I think it's important for us, again, to look at the country and all of its beauty, all of its antiquity as we get started here. So we'll be starting with this video that's essentially entitled Before the Quake.
Many people compare Kathmandu to places in India or places in Tibet. But in reality, the city is truly a unique place in our world. There's few places where multiculturalism, spiritualism, and religion are so intertwined with urban life. Temples stand side by side with shops, clubs, and restaurants. Monks can be praying on one side of the street while kids rock out to heavy metal on the other side. The place is saturated with color, both metaphorically and physically speaking. About a month ago, I passed through Kathmandu to film an episode of 36 Hours for the travel section. Most of our time was spent in and around the city's ancient sites and temples. And the one thing that makes the city so unique is that these places are public places where people gather and socialize and do business. However, most of these sites are made up of fired bricks, mud mortar, and aging timber. These places are often over 500 years old. Many of the buildings you're seeing were razed to the ground in this latest earthquake. Thousands have been killed. Both the human and cultural loss is immeasurable. While the people of Kathmandu mourn and begin to recover from this horrible event, I hope this footage can act as a record of history as to what life was like in the temples weeks before they came down.
beautifully lyrical images there. I think it's again important to put that in perspective, to have those memories, and to realize, of course, that the country will rebuild and regain, that place. I don't think I've established this, but just to let our viewers know, part of the reason why this show is special to me is that probably the trip that had the most meaning of any trip I've ever taken was taken with my mom in 1989. And Mom had lived in North India, in Kanpur and Uttar Pradesh, where she was a teacher, and she also, both when she was in India and over the years, assisted many young artists. So we went back, and in Mumbai, there were 200 artists from all over the country that flew in to thank her, and many of her students did as well. But at the very end of the trip, a 6-week trip to South Asia, we went to the Kathmandu Valley and then to Pokhara. And so, in watching all of these scenes, these are places I knew, and there were memories of people that were very important. So, while it's not my homeland, it certainly is an attachment there.
Yeah.
So it's very meaningful to be able to capture that, and we hope throughout this hour to educate people on this place and its people. Before we do get further into that, as I told you, I think I just want to set the lay of the land a little bit. Of course, one of the things, an aspect of this, aside from the earthquake as it played out in the Kathmandu Valley and in cities and rural areas throughout, was the fact that the earthquake triggered an avalanche at Mount Everest. And so let's, if we could, go into a brief report on how that played itself out. Late April and early May is the time when there are a disproportionate number of people that are climbing the mountain. And Joe, I know you have some firsthand observations about all of that, but let's watch this report that actually captures an avalanche sweeping down the mountain and into the base camps.
A very good evening. I'm Ankit Tyagi. Continuing focus here on headlines today on the massive earthquake that has hit Nepal. A massive tragedy is unfolding at the Everest Base Camp in Nepal, the worst ever for the world's highest mountain that is revered in the tiny nation. This is the video of a massive avalanche approaching one of Everest's base camps. The huts you see at the bottom of the screen are dwarfed by the devastating wall of snow approaching the camp. A fresh avalanche was triggered after major aftershock today in the afternoon. The avalanche reported swamped Base Camp 1. Not much information is available of the situation there right now. Earlier, 17 bodies were recovered from the lower base camp, but according to monitoring authorities, this could be just the tip of the iceberg. Reports say more than 1,000 climbers, including 400 foreigners, were at Everest Base Camp or were climbing at the time of the earthquake. Most of them still remain missing. Bad weather is meanwhile hampering the search and rescue operations.
So Joe Elder, you were telling me that you've been to the base camp, and in this case I think the scene was at Base Camp 1, the lowest level. Or if we could show that picture of Mount Everest just to give people context for the mountain. Of course, this exists essentially the Nepali-Tibetan border bisects the mountain. Generally, it's an easier approach from the Nepali side. So there are, at this time of year, there's probably, I think, upwards of 1,000 people that are making the ascent.
It's a little bit tricky because you have to get in queue and you have to pay for a fee to do it. The Nepali government tries to keep some kind of control over what happens and to protect the Sherpas, because the Sherpa's life is at risk, and the rules now are that if the Sherpas you hire, you have to provide life insurance for. So
just in case people don't know, could you explain who the Sherpas are?
The Sherpas are people who live in the area who, for decades, have been the carriers of the heavy stuff that you go up the hills with. And their lungs are acclimated to the thin atmosphere up there, so they can, in a sense, move much more with much greater strength than people from outside or from lower levels. And the long tradition of Sherpas being sturdy and knowing the weather and knowing the signs of the snows and so on is a great tradition of the Sherpas being people who really love the mountains. And they have their own notion at the very top of Mount Everest. There is the sort of goddess that controls the universe. And so you approach it with some reverence and you pray when you get to the top of the mountain as an indication that this is a massive part of the nature of which we are just small parts.
9 out of the 10 highest mountains in the world are in Nepal, with the exception of K2,
pretty
maybe?
close to that, yeah. There's some in Pakistan, but and when you fly from Kathmandu to Everest, you just see so many mountains that are covered with snow, and you know that if they're covered with snow, they're over 19,000 feet
Yeah.
already. Now, Everest is 29,000 feet, so you have a sense of you're at the top of the world.
Something that's on my bucket list is there's a flight that goes out of Kathmandu that actually circles the mountain.
I have taken that flight.
Yeah.
And the time I took it was charming because when we got to it, there was a cloud covering the top, and the pilot said, "I know you people are disappointed. Let me fly on to another 15 minutes and come back and see if the cloud's cleared." So he flew on toward the west for a while, came back, and by the time we came back, the cloud had cleared, and the tip of Everest was through the cloud. So I have this great shot of clouds with Everest sticking up right in the middle of it.
Right, right. Well, my mom arrived in North India in about 1952, and I don't think she ever. So the two people who were the first to climb Everest were Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay.
That's right.
And I don't think she got to meet Sir Edmund, but she did get to meet Tenzing Norgay. I don't know. Do you have any reflections, Krishna, on kind of the importance of that step and the fact that I think in some ways, to the world's credit, they didn't just call Tenzing a guide, but he was given due credit for
Right.
the fact that he made the ascent.
Well, I was a little boy
Sure.
when that happened, but there was a nice folk song or a country song about Tenzing Norgay.
And there was an agreement between the two of them that neither one would ever say who actually was first. They agreed that this was a secret that they would share, and it went to both of their deaths. Nobody ever found out who was actually the first. But Norgay did plant a prayer for the goddess of the mountain as part of what he did, and I think there was a New Zealand flag or something planted beside it to indicate it was an international event.
Well, the other piece of history that comes to mind with that time, which of course was about the time that India was becoming independent, relative to Nepal, it was a time when the country was opening up. I think I've told you this before, but my mother was good friends with the Flemings. There's a book called The Fabulous Flemings of Kathmandu. They were some of the first Westerners to be into the country, and they went, I think, bird watching with the royal family was their point of entree.
And they produced one of the most important books on birds in Nepal, which is still a classic.
But we rely on both of you to hear this, but we cannot cover thousands of years of history in the course of a few minutes here. But just remarking that time and what the opening up to the rest of the world meant, why it had been important before then, perhaps to have Nepal be kind of a closed kingdom or a place unto itself. But then, what did that transition mean when Westerners started coming in?
Well, it began sort of with the early explorers, but it was sealed off essentially as a country where it was extremely difficult to get into, physically and otherwise. I know when Ambassador Chester Bowles was to be the ambassador both to India and Nepal, they had a picture of him on his trip from Delhi up to Kathmandu, and he was on muleback because there was no direct way in which he could get there before the airports were up there. So you can say within the last half a century, Nepal has opened up, and once it was open, tourists from all over the place, campers, amazing number of people who just have been fascinated by Nepal, and a whole series of studies of Tibetan language and Nepali language and the art and architecture of that area, which is all fabulous.
Krishna, if I'm not being, please go ahead.
We saw the change in education and health and transportation. That was the conspicuous change.
You might say a little about the fact
up.
that when you grew up in Bandipur. And when you wanted to get from Bandipur to Kathmandu, you walked, and it took 7 days.
7 days,
Okay.
yes. That was the norm.
That was when you were a boy.
There were
Quite
no
a
roads.
distance. Wow.
Yeah.
So if I'm not being impertinent, what year were you born, Krishna? May I ask?
In Bandipur.
But I'm sorry, what year were you born?
Oh,
Just to-
1939.
1939. So
July.
again, when this transition was occurring in the early 50s, you were a young boy about to become a teenager. But do you remember a difference as people from the West started coming into Nepal? As you said, it had educational and other implications for the society. But I mean, for your parents and for other people, did that mean both positive and negative things? Or?
We hardly saw any Westerners.
Yeah.
In the 50s. If anybody came, and there were some recruiters for the, Nepali army. In Malaya, they called Malaya, Malaysia, Singapore, and some of them came, and they were kind of point of interest.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
People will just flock around the foreigner and
Recruiter who's
you know,
coming to see if there are any young men who want to serve in the
very different,
Malay
you know,
army or the Indian
very
army.
different.
Right.
So
I'm going to throw our producer off and go a little bit out of order, but Mara, if we could go past kind of the earthquake photos to the beginning of the photos, including my own. It begins with a picture of a boat on a lake with mountains in the background, and this was at Pokhara, and maybe I told you so we stayed at here we are, Fishtail Lodge, and I will tell you, I was on a similar boat like that, making my way across the lake to a Buddhist temple. As in the background, you can't see it here because the fog is still there. But at some point, the fog lifts in the morning, and then the entire Annapurna range is laid out before you. And this is where I go when I need a place of quiet contemplation in my mind's eye. I go back to Pokhara. But as we're talking about that, so many of the images we're seeing right now take place in the Kathmandu Valley, and this was on a short trek, out of town, a group of young boys playing some sort of a game together, and some of the young people in a marketplace. But anyway, because again, I think so many images come out of Kathmandu. It's a very varied country, and of course, it's not all in the mountains. The Terai and middle altitudes, the hill country, and then the mountains. It's very different places in a very short physical space.
yeah, because of the altitude difference, you go from the plain to the highest mountain. And although Nepal is in the same latitude as Florida,
Right.
you get all the climate zones, So
So if you didn't have the
variable.
altitude, it's essentially a
Yeah.
subtropical place,
Yeah.
very much like Florida.
Yeah, if you go in the plain, it's hot and not so cold. But if you are on the 4,000, 5,000 elevation, it's a mild. Like Bandipur, average temperature may be just 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't remember getting down below 40 or anything.
Right.
Sometimes maybe wind chill. You could feel like 25, but there was never an ice or anything. It never snowed.
So I imagine you had to adjust your notion of what cold is when you moved to Madison, Wisconsin.
It's hard to imagine. Yeah.
And the way in which the mountains themselves have kind of a religious quality. You're mentioning Annapurna.
Yep.
Now, the Annapurna range is sort of like a bowl with the mountains around it. And then there's this mountain in the middle called Fishtail.
Yes,
And nobody is allowed to hike on Fishtail,
I know. Yeah.
even though there are any number of hikers who'd like to do it. But that is sacred, and if you're going to walk, you cannot walk on Fishtail.
We stayed at the Fishtail Lodge. We pulled ourselves out on a raft to
Yeah.
what was still very modern, very comfortable accommodations. But I was also explaining to you that a picture that I took of Fishtail is the picture that I have given about 24 times to people significant in my life that I felt have made a difference in the world. And so for me, there's a deep symbolism there. There's just something amazing about the fact that there can still be an unclimbed mountain in
That's
this
right.
world.
And it does look like a fishtail
Yes, it does. It does.
Yeah, from the side.
from the side.
Yeah.
One of the other mountains, I think it was Annapurna 4, but it was first climbed in 1983 by an all-female team of climbers.
Yeah.
So also interesting significance. I want to get in just a moment into again talking about the earthquake. But while we're talking about Bandipur, Joe, you were explaining that this is a place that's been, or you're familiar with. It's much studied. I mean, in some ways, in microcosm, Bandipur is maybe a good place to tell people about
Well, the
the nature.
main reason Bandipur is important is because of Krishna.
Okay.
Krishna worked first for the Peace Corps and is a gifted language teacher. I can say that because I've seen many of his students. And he was picked up as a particularly qualified person. Say a little about your life. You went to Wales to get special training.
Yeah.
You came back, and then Wisconsin picked you up.
Yeah. Basically, my connection coming to the University of Wisconsin was from Peace Corps. I was a high school teacher, but then I got into English training, which was organized and run by British Council. And then when I took the class for 20 weeks, I topped the class and they sent me to Cardiff.
He says that very
Wales.
modestly, but he did top the class and was selected on this unique job to go to Wales, Cardiff.
Well, part of the reason I was bringing, again, this transitional time when Nepal was opening up to the world, had that not happened, of course, probably some of those options wouldn't have been available to you.
Exactly, because when I grew up, there was no high school. Actually, just a grade school where we learned to read and write. That's all, in Nepali, and some math, basic math, And so I was telling Joe that, when you have no funding for education and things like that, it sounds like I'm going back to my childhood days, So, but anyway, when I went to Peace Corps for teaching, and then that's how the connection came to the university. University had some funding, the department, the Indian Studies department had some funding, and they looked for teachers, and I was recommended with another colleague, and a professor came and interviewed us, and I was chosen, and I'm here.
And I saw the same kind of thing when I was in Nepal with a group of graduate students who were funded to do research. And I was in the Surkate area where people were moving in. And we were there one day when the village agreed that today was the day they were going to repair their school. They built a school, and then the rainy season had come, and now they're going to rebuild it. And the word went out, every household must send a person with a basket and a power and gather the dirt and make the mud to go on the outside of the school. I thought, this is an old tradition, but that's the way they kept the school going. There's sort of a teacher who came with a salary from the government, but the school maintenance was up to the village.
So another context, I think, that Mandapur may provide some lessons, but so statistically speaking, I think Nepal is one of the poorest countries on earth in terms of per capita income. But I was talking to a young man named Surendra, who's a student leader and active in the Nepali American Friendship Association. He was helping me to maybe understand the distinction, though, that it is also a place where virtually no one goes hungry. And I think partly because of the communitarian experience, people are watching out for each other. So it's maybe not poverty in the way that we normally think about it. People have limited resources, but they make the most of what they have. But I'm just wondering, in your family situation, was there a time when you again, living relatively modestly, you suddenly made this transition to living out in the world?
In terms of living, we were never want of food or anything. But in terms of choices, you have very little.
Yeah.
I ate only potatoes and rice and dal, the bean soup, all winter. The vegetables very scarce in the villages. But in Kathmandu, they had good farmland, in the valley, very fertile land, which is not to be seen now.
Yeah.
It's all covered with buildings.
Buildings, right.
So, this point of people not being so poor in terms of begging or something. If you think of, you don't see as many beggars in Kathmandu or Nepal as in India. And then when you see beggars, they are really emaciated in India and Nepal. And when you think of poor people in America, they're all
At least relatively healthy.
relatively healthy. Actually, when you saw big-sized people, they said, "Oh, you are very healthy. If you are emaciated, so you must be diseased." That's the concept, we have.
For me, Kathmandu was a real contrast to Mumbai or to Delhi or to the other places we'd been in India. I think you're spotlighting some of it, but it was also probably the place that I think I felt most comfortable as a Westerner. We were staying in the Hotel Everest, and I think all of the staff there, we made really great friends. We got bumped from our airplane out of Nepal because the king needed an airplane apparently. But I remember a guy who rode me around on a moped and make sure I was okay. And someday I need to look him up because I owe him, really big. But the friendships were made, and of course, as we're noting, there are a lot of American tourists that hang out in the Kathmandu Valley, especially in Kathmandu. There's a Hamburger Mary's place that I guess goes way back. So it's interesting. A place that was so isolated from the West, in some ways, in that region, strikes me as a place where there's a real affinity for Westerners. Does that make sense on some level?
Yeah.
And a number of study programs. Pitzer College has had a
Yeah.
program there for decades. And Wisconsin had a program there for 25 years. And if you added up all the students who studied 2 years of intensive Nepali or 2 years of intensive Tibetan, there's several hundred University of Wisconsin students who have lived for a year in Nepal and have a moderate knowledge of either Tibetan or Nepali. And that's sort of filtered out throughout the United States.
So one other thing we do want to establish, and you're modest enough not to put this out in your bio or anything, but as Joe was explaining, you have the distinction of having started the first Nepali restaurant in this country. And Mara, if we could just flash ahead to those 3 slides of Vimal Chuli. Of course, on State Street, also ran a restaurant called Chadara until recently.
Yeah.
But what was the significance of that? Maybe I told you, Surendra, the young student I talked to, just said, "Wow, what a gift to have a Nepali restaurant right here in Madison." But I think the community has appreciated that too.
Yeah, actually it took a while to decide, whether to open a restaurant or not. We looked around. Even some students were encouraging us.
Sure.
They will come
And
home.
some faculty.
Yeah, they will come home and eat with us and say, "Oh, you have to open a restaurant." And then later on, I thought about it, and I tried 1 or 2 places, and they say, this guy doesn't have any business experience. They wouldn't want to rent me their space. But then later on, I thought about it, and then I thought, I am selling my skill of teaching Nepali, teaching a language. Then I thought, my wife cooks well. She should sell her skill too. And that's the way we decided.
Immensely successful. And then the choice of the words, Himal Chuli means sort of ovens of the Himalayas.
Right.
And at the same time, there's something ovens of Brittany. And so you had these two,
Which is more or less
almost
right.
across
Right.
the street.
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah.
And then Chautara, the name of the other one, that's a unique Nepali phenomenon. When you're trekking, you have these heavy backpacks.
Right.
And when you want to sit down in a village, you need a special sort of bench. And typically it's around a tree. So you don't even take your backpack off. You just sit down and the weight is lifted off your shoulders. And it's incredibly relaxing. And that's the Chautara. It's
Yeah.
made for sitting
With
backpack.
the two holy trees
That's
called Bar and People.
Yeah, and then when it's time to go, you sort of just lift up and it's right there. You get up with a
Yeah.
60-pound sack and you're off on your next trip.
So I told you there are a couple of connections for me. First of all, seeing the Fishtail Mountain and that being the significant place and bringing back great memories. But Joe and I are both involved with an organization called the United Nations Association, and I'm
Yeah.
now on the National Steering Committee. So being in New York at the UN a couple months ago, when I'm trying to explain how Madison is this international place because of the university, because of all the NGOs that are located and everything else, the thing I hop right to is we've got about 7 or 8 Indian restaurants, a similar number of Thai restaurants, and they're kind of amazed at that. But when I mentioned that we have a Nepali restaurant, Himal Chuli, that blows them out of the water.
Even several Nepali.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
No,
In a
yeah.
city of a couple 100,000 people,
No.
that's amazing. So that's
Yeah.
a great gift.
Yeah,
But I
yeah.
think, again, it's evocative of that international tradition here, and Nepal is a very important part of
Yeah,
that.
yeah. We were very, very happy that it was kind of accepted. The community accepted.
Not only accepted,
No.
loved.
Yeah,
It's a treasure.
now it has become a community, and my wife, although she is now cannot do what she could do before, she still loves to be there
Yeah.
every day. Yeah.
And our interview with Surendra, he'll mention this, but again, I think it is key to why Madison is a special place for
Oh,
many
yes.
Nepali
Yes,
Americans.
yes.
So I want to, again, shift gears a little bit. We do, of course, want to recognize the significance of the earthquake. If we could go to clip 3, Mara, and we'll have juxtaposed a couple of clips here in a row, about 30 seconds each, that just give you a picture of what it looked like as the 7.9 magnitude quake was hitting and some of the immediate aftermath. So if we could play that clip, please, Mara. and some scenes of the earthquake hitting. Mara, in just a second, we want to go to those before and after shots at the beginning of the photo sequence. So I'm curious, have you been in a major earthquake? I know.
No, just a small one, and I just remember my mother saying about her experience, which happened 80 plus years.
So could we talk
ago.
about just briefly? Surrenda mentioned this too. His grandmother was a young girl. Remembered that earthquake. So that was the last time anything of
Yeah.
this magnitude happened.
Yes.
1934, there was a huge earthquake, and people are sort of going back and saying this one is sort of at the same level. It did enormous damage, not only in India, but also in Nepal, but also in India. And one of the projects that I've been involved with, this Mithila Art Project, is right close to the border. And one of the people I got in touch with was the people in that area. It's in India technically, but just across the border, and they don't dare go back to their houses. There's so many aftershocks.
And it was a similar experience that many of the holy shrines and other buildings of antiquity were destroyed in that earthquake back
Oh yeah,
in 1934.
a great many, right?
In terms of temples, I guess there was not as much damage. I know the Dharara, the tower that we talked about, originally was to be 13 stories, and they tumbled down and they came down to 9 stories. So.
And the purpose of the tower was to be a place where a person with a loud voice could go up and make announcements. It was sort of a public announcement area.
This was in Hindu traditions or Buddhist traditions, the tower.
Tower, no, it was actually established by a prime minister. So
Was there-
Bhimsen Thapa.
Yeah.
So more of
He
a
was
secular
the third-
purpose.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah.
And it was a public broadcasting place when you didn't have a microphone.
So to establish this briefly, Nepal is a Hindu kingdom, and yet Buddhism also has its roots
Yeah.
there.
Oh,
A very
yeah.
important
Yeah.
place for that.
Yeah, and then shamanistic, you know,
Yep.
like Bompo religion,
Right.
influenced by all the religions. And when you were talking about, Paul, Amitabh Paul, I was saying, he would go to Ramadan or something.
Just briefly,
I
he's-
think
he's
if,
so-
we used to, there was one mosque in Kathmandu. That's where we went just to relax.
Yeah.
They had nice flower garden just by the Ghantaghar,
I remember
you
that.
know,
Yeah, I know where it is,
tower,
right.
yeah. So,
And there's
I would, if some Muslim invited me, I would willingly go to the mosque.
Right.
Or, I feel like going to Makkah, Medina,
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So
And there's
we
a
have
unique
no,
variant of Buddhism called Newari Buddhism, which is a rich mixture of both Hinduism and Buddhism, and absolutely unique to Nepal. There are many versions of Buddhism in Japan and Korea and so on, but Newari Buddhism is unique
Yeah.
to Nepal.
Buddha was born in Nepal or in North India, or we were not sure. or-
Born in
yeah,
Lumbini.
Buddha, it's born in Lumbini. When Buddha was born, and there was no country as such,
Right.
Nepal. But now it's within the border of Nepal. But Indian historians sometimes say he was born in India. And
Lumbini-
Nepalese complain,
Yeah,
and
well,
so
On a map, Lumbini
So
is
historically,
in
yeah.
Nepal.
Yeah.
And then he went to Bodh Gaya where he was inspired, and then he went to Benares where he began his first teaching.
Yeah.
This Bodh Gaya, there was stupas.
Yeah.
Bodh
Oh,
Gaya.
yeah.
I remember
Every
visiting
place there.
and
memorials.
Sarnath.
And in the early days, you didn't show the image of Buddha.
For 500 years they didn't.
Right.
And then first they'd be symbolized by feet or by the royal umbrellas, and then gradually the notion of pictures of Buddha began to appear, statues.
Yeah, in terms of religion, whenever somebody asks, "Are you a Hindu or something?" I kind of stop and think, I like to say that I am everything, I mean, because in Kathmandu itself, if you go to Pashupatinath, which is a Hindu temple, there would be Buddha in his
Yeah.
meditation pose. And then you go to Bodhanath or Swayambhu, then you would have Hindu temples. There would be Durga, there would be Lakshmi, all that.
And those are major Buddhist constructs. So
Yeah.
in a Buddhist place you have Hindu deities, in a Hindu place you have the Buddhist forms.
So to bring that point home, that many Americans who embrace Buddhism, this is a very important place. I spoke with Zach Larson last night, one of your former
Okay,
students, who's
right.
sort of a extended family member to me. And Zach, I think
Zach went on the program
and
he
learned Nepali and
he
Tibetan.
learned
I think.
Tibetan,
Tibetan.
and actually wrote a book eventually on a Rinpoche.
Translated the work of Buddhist monks, but
Yeah.
he just expressed what a life-changing place Nepal was for him. Fortunately, the audio quality was such. We'll have to have him in the studio because
Yeah.
we'll do a second show on this. But that brought it home. Mark, can we go to the three maps, please? As we're establishing a context for the earthquakes, this is also just a way for anyone who doesn't know where Nepal is in the greater scheme of things. Here's a picture of South India. Of course, Nepal kind of in the center there in dark colors. Let's go on to that next slide if we could. For people who want to understand why an earthquake of this magnitude could take place, it's a reminder that in terms of continental drift, that India was actually, and Sri Lanka, I guess, were originally very much distant from the main continent. They're called the subcontinent for a reason. And over time, this is maybe going back 300 to 500 million years ago or so, as the continents came into place and Pangaea broke apart into the Americas and Eurasia and Africa, India was kind of drifting up through the Indian Ocean and eventually kind of wedged its way up across where Tibet is now. And that's what produced the Himalayas. And India is still pushing up against the main continent. And that is, in fact, what produces earthquakes.
Exactly. In fact, at the top of Everest, there's an indication at some point it was at the bottom of the sea in terms of the
So there are fossils.
Fossils that indicate,
yeah.
Which is sort of scary because it's now 29,000 feet up.
Yes.
A lot of pushing.
Absolutely. Let's go on while we're on maps to that third slide. I think we already brought this point home. Nepal, I think, I've heard it described as roughly the size of Arkansas. It's a bit more long and narrow, but I think the other thing we described, so adjacent to the Indian border, again, is this area called the Terai that's at relatively low latitudes, essentially subtropical. And there's the hill country that then leads into the Himalayas. But again, in a very small space, just all kinds of different climates and ecosystems and other things. So it's very unusual, very special place in that way. So let's now move ahead actually to our interview with Surendra, I think, which will evoke a number of different themes. And Surendra Prajapati is a young man who studies at the university. I believe he's a researcher it has a couple of different roles. He's now the president of the Nepali Student Association at the University of Wisconsin, and also the public information officer for what I think most cities probably don't have, which is the Nepali American Friendship Association. And we'll see in this video some pictures of the group gathered together. He explains this is a fairly substantial group of people. I think the phone connection again was a little tenuous and a little bit murky, but I think people will understand this. If not, we'll go back and put some captions on it later. But Surendra, I think, had a number of different observations that are very cogent to what folks are living through right now about the sense of supportive community that people both derive from each other in the Nepali community, but also from the community at large. Surendra Prajapati. And if I may ask, in your case, you're able to find family? Is everyone doing okay?
Yeah, so my immediate family members are all fine, unfortunately. So we have eight deaths in my neighborhood itself, within two minutes of my house. We have a lot of houses that have collapsed, a lot of old houses in my neighborhood that have collapsed, but most of the people are safe.
Are the people that you know, by and large, still sleeping outside?
Oh, yeah. I mean, except for when it's raining, maximum of people were sleeping outside, or staying outside most of the time. Just because within the last 2 days, there were over, I think, 24 aftershocks.
Could you describe kind of the nature of the Nepali community here in Madison? How many Nepali connected people are there in Madison?
So in the university, we are about 10, 12 students, but the Nepali Madison community is over 200 people. So those who can relate to Nepalese culture, Nepalese language, are more than 300 in Madison.
And the sense of supportive community that you might gather from that group and also from the student group, is that something that's been helpful at a time like this?
of course. We are a very Nepalese society is very close knit type community. I mean, we have always been together, and we worry about each other. We try to find answers for each other when in distress. Like people are asking each other, like that was the first day. So when this happened, everybody's phone was ringing almost all day. So first they found out about their own families back home, and then after that they started calling all their neighbors to make sure everybody's family was okay. That's the kind of mentality we have. We want to make sure everybody's fine. Everybody's accounted for.
Well, that's got to be a great comfort at a time like this, especially. But yeah, part of the bigger picture too. Well, how have people outside the circle of the Nepali community within Madison, how have people in the larger community responded? Have you felt that your colleagues at the university and in the larger community, if they become aware that you're from Nepal, have they been supportive?
Yes. In fact, I mean, I've been myself been contacted by a lot of my colleagues and my professors, both my department. So yeah, the university has been supportive as well.
Coming back to that sense of spirituality, are there aspects of people's faith, whether it be Buddhist or Hindu or other faith traditions, that help put a time like this, the loss of life, the need to find peace in the midst of chaos? Are there aspects of the spirituality of the Nepali people that perhaps would give them special ability to get through a time like this?
Yeah, I mean, so there is a spiritual belief about life after death kind of thing. The soul never dies, right?
Yeah.
And then your loved ones are still with you or with God, for example. Those kinds of things are there. And I think in a way it helps people to have, that bond is go for a long time. And when somebody passes away, there are certain rituals we go through to have that feeling. We do a lot of ritual cremation in Nepal in most cases, and it's done in a different way. Based on what I've seen, the spirituality does help. And I think what helps the most is the whole community is there for them. When, for example, if I speak to my own community, my own neighborhood, when a person dies in our community, it's not just your immediate relatives who will go to the funeral. It's the whole neighborhood that will go to the funeral.
In the hope that this might lead to a deeper understanding of Nepal and its peoples, what would you hope that people in Madison or Americans in general would learn about Nepal? What would you hope that they might discover about your country?
I think one thing they will definitely see about Nepal is how they feel about themselves as a Nepalese, that they are very proud to be a Nepali, and they are ready to rebuild the country. They are very welcoming and very friendly and honest people in Nepal. And we always love our guests coming to Nepal, and we also appreciate the support we get from all around the world. It's such a beautiful country with a lot of diversity. I think the diversity itself is our identity, not only in terms of people, but also in terms of the way of life, the places they live, in terms of the geographical locations.
Yes.
And then just the way of life, but one thing they all have in common, I think, is a sense of togetherness, a sense of closeness with each other. There is not a lot of secret things between neighbors. Everybody in your village. Everything about who lives next to you, for example. But that's the kind of community we have over there. And
thank you so much for the gift of this conversation, and much appreciation, Surendra, and best to you and your family. So just many beautiful thoughts and images there, but the spirit of, I guess, community values. I was telling Surendra, my father, at the same time my mom was in India, early 1950s, lived in South Korea, which, ironically at the time was probably one of the poorest nations on the earth. Came back to 1957 America, And it was such a contrast to him because, again, the community spirit of people who had very little materially but were there for him. And then also, as Narendra is commenting on, the traditions of hospitality, welcoming people into your home, wherever they might be from in the world. Those are things that really resonate with kind of the people's experience in Nepal, aren't they?
Guests are considered as gods, you know. Yeah. So they could be, you know, in the form of God, or so you don't really, you know, not welcome them, you know. So everybody's welcome, you know. So you know, I mean, even like I just said, you know, we have had a lot of home builders from Muslim community, from India border, and they were all welcome, you know. Yeah, there was nothing like untouchable or anything like that. So.
Now, Narendra made the observation that at least in his experience, and he communicates fairly well with both Nepali Americans, whether they're associated with UW or not, roughly the several hundred or two or 300, I think he was identifying folks that have some connection with Nepali culture. As best he can tell, no one lost anyone in the earthquake. And again, we don't diminish what over 3,000 deaths would mean for a country the size of Nepal, which is roughly 22 million, I think.
Now it's 30
million?
Yeah.
I mean, but you know, still that's a huge effect in any place. But conversely, to put this in perspective, you know, again, the images we see are of kind of chaos and disruption, and that's a reality. And you know, you were telling me that most of your relatives are still sleeping outdoors. But again, it's against a backdrop that perhaps, again, we shouldn't take that moment in time and imprint in our memory and think there's always disruption or chaos, all the things that come with the disaster. Joe and I did a show on this about 10 years ago in the wake of the tsunami. You just have to put those things in perspective. And if we're to meaningfully try to reach out to the Nepali people, we certainly should make donations and if folks are engineers or other people that have those abilities to be able to help, I think, you know, it sounds like they might be welcome. But anyway, Joe, do you have any thoughts on that? Just to, you know, how we put something like this in perspective and not stigmatize people when they go through something like this.
I think, interestingly enough, the tsunami, which was devastating, did teach lessons about planning in advance for something like this.
Yeah.
And on television, I've seen a number of people who said they knew this was coming. There was going to be a bad earthquake, and so there were resources made available so that when it came, almost immediately people had the tools that they needed to dig things out and start working. And then the flow of supplies from NGOs and other India sent people in to help out sort of immediately. So a little better prepared in terms of the fact that this was going to happen. But still, when it happens, it is a tragedy, and a lot of people lose their lives.
So the other observation I remember from that interview 10 years ago, which I happened to listen to last week, randomly go through my old radio shows every now and then, was you know, you made something I think would surprise a lot of people. We consider ourselves to be a very generous country, but in the context of the tsunami, I think we were 20th or something in terms of giving. Certainly Australians were way ahead of us. But you know, I think the thing that would really amaze people is the U.S. offered all kinds of help, and India said, no, thank you. We have it under control. In some sense, is there a parallel situation here that South Asia may take care of its own people?
Certainly, the immediate response from neighbors has been consistent with that. That we're close. We have people. We can, within 10 hours we can be in with supplies and water and blankets. Whereas if you're trying to fly it in from store places in Europe or the United States, it's days and the complicated stuff of import and all the rest. No, there's a big community around there that is helping out, along with just a lot of Nepali organizations that I've been on email to a number of places. There are these Buddhist monasteries that are collecting money and other sorts of NGOs that are right now on location doing things that need to be done.
Here in Madison tonight, this will be after the show airs, but there's a vigil at Deer Park tomorrow night, Wednesday at the Capitol vigil. So you know, again, partly because Buddhism is something embraced by many people who grew up in Christian faith or other faith, and then later, at least incorporated into their beliefs. You know, I guess that's another Madison resonant, you know, theme here. Does that make sense?
Sure, and the fact that we do have a major Tibetan Buddhist temple just outside Madison is another indication of how the world does intermingle very easily, much more easily now than it did maybe a century ago.
So, Krishna, as we saw this picture of this large gathering of Nepali Americans, who have a home here in Madison, could you also reflect on that sense of supportive community that people have derived from each other and how that's played out this last week?
We are all communicating with each other, and that's been the big support. We call a nephew here in Florida or niece in California, so we are all, feeding each other with the messages and news. So it has been very supportive.
Has it been difficult to communicate with people directly in Nepal? Has that changed over the days?
Yes, it has been difficult, but we have gotten through at times.
And
So
20 years ago, we didn't have cell phones or
Oh,
all the
no, no,
technology.
no.
25 years ago, I didn't communicate with my father for 6 weeks, which has
Yeah.
never happened before. But
Yeah, now
but
it
it's
has
changed.
been instantaneous,
Right.
So, yeah. Sometimes they don't have a line, and so you couldn't, the other day I called and I hear all the noise, and what is this, this Viber program, if you know, you can call the Viber phone free. And especially Kathmandu and India, very clear, but Nepal sometimes not clear, at times very clear. And so this nephew was in the streets and said, I hear a lot of noise, what is this?
He said, "I'm in the
We
street."
don't want to go into the house, so we are just waiting outside. And that was in the night.
how do you feel about how the American media have handled this? Have they reported accurately, or again, have they erred on the side of somehow stigmatizing or making folks in the disaster objects of pity? They walked that line fairly well. I would just say, first of all, this has been the lead story for the last several days, whether it's on CNN or the network newscast. But I don't know, Channel 15 last night. It was a story that went on for 5 minutes about how people are responding locally. So anyway, what kind of a grade do you give the media? Are they getting it this time?
Sometimes you get the feeling that it's kind of horrible
Right.
incident. But yesterday I was not able to watch. CNN was showing the heroes and survivors at 8 o'clock. Did you have chance to watch that?
I didn't see that. I read about it a little bit.
yeah.
Well, and this is good too, but even that was sort of
Yeah.
a mixed, because again, the focus is on the disaster, and there's a broader culture and a broader reality here.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Joe, do you have a sense of how we reversed that? I think you were saying 10 years ago they were beginning. It used to be that India we would only see in case of a riot, a political disaster, or a physical disaster. We're finally understanding that I mean, India and Nepal are two different places, but South Asia, the future of the world lies there. This is a place on the ascendancy, and it's really absurd that we don't know more about this part of the world. Is that changing?
Yeah, one thing I've been impressed by has been an awareness that the earthquake has damaged World Heritage sites.
Yes.
That Nepal is a place where there are treasures that the world should preserve. Bhaktapur was a town that was kind of reconstructed, and just this morning I heard that it had been damaged. And the notion that UNESCO would put a big effort, I'm sure there'll be a big effort as soon as things settle down to reconstruct and put back together those amazing historic sites that have been around for centuries.
I know we established this, but Surendra is from Bhaktapur.
Yeah.
Again, he evoked a sense of community in so many different dimensions, but he talked about what he knows is going on back in his neighborhood. And again, that innate spirituality that helps ground people there. And just try to explain, when a death occurs in the neighborhood, in this case, while he didn't lose family members, he does know that 8 people in the neighborhood did pass. And that everyone will be at their funeral.
Yeah.
Another friend was telling me that in Hindu traditions, I think it's a 49-day period which you sort of shepherd, or you're there hoping that the person will pass on to the next life and other things. But Surendra, again, is that a thread that weaves itself, whether it's in a neighborhood back in Bhaktapur or the way that people relate to each other here?
Yes, same. Yeah.
So anyway, out of something like this, a realization of the strength and resilience of the people.
And a built-in process of remembering, gathering, and then deciding to move on. This happens all the time. It's concentrated now, but it will continue to happen, and life goes on.
So let me just give you both a chance for some final thoughts. We've got just about 3 minutes left in the show, but
Go ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, well, so much more is known about Nepal now than it was 30 years ago. The very fact that it has opened up and become something of a favorite spot. You know, on one hand, you are saddened when you see tourists coming and kind of trampling on an area. On the other half, the tourists often pick up a sense of what Nepal is all about and bring back a quality that will remain with them in their lives. Not just, I happen to be in Nepal, but I brought back some lessons about my life from Nepal.
Is there anything that you think that people maybe don't understand about Nepal that this offers a window of opportunity, or what would you like to see? I know that's a broad question, but Krishna, but you know, some sense of what you know of your land and its people. What would you like people here to understand?
You know, Nepal basically is a very welcoming place, and they accept diversity. And Nepalese will go through because they have gone through a lot and they don't lose hope. That will carry them, further. So,
Well, thank you both for a wonderful conversation. Mara will cue up that last few seconds of video that kind of recount some of the disasters, but it ends on a positive slide that's been shared on Facebook about, again, the strength, the resilience of the people in Nepal to persevere. And I'll be back with some final thoughts in just a moment. I have no doubt Nepal will bounce back. Again, we thank you for joining us today. We hope actually to revisit the subject of Nepal and its people perhaps later in the summer. I think it's important both for people to understand the struggles out of a tragedy like this are going to be ongoing and people need to help. We haven't listed a specific website, but we encourage you to Google information. There are a variety of charities that are helping where you can give financial help. But also the theme I've heard from so many people is just to simply offer prayer. For people and a culture and others. That is an important energy to put out into the world this time. Thank you so much to our guests, Krishna, Pradhan, Joe Elder. This has been Forward Forum. Again, we have a new website, rather a new email address to reach us. It's forwardforumshow@gmail.com. Or, of course, you can always reach us at the Sun Prairie Media Center by phone or via email. Let us know your ideas for future shows. Again, it's going to be one of my favorites because a very special place, and I'm very pleased to share it with two very special people. This has been Forward Forum. I'm John Quinlan. Have a good week.